$10 trillion worth of debt needs to be refinanced in the coming years. The cheap debt borrowed at 2 to 3% yields will be maturing and rolling over, so Scott Bessent will need to replace it with a new debt at 4 to 5% yield at minimum. He cannot simply print $10 trillion to pay it back without destroying the currency entirely. It's going to cause hyperinflation. And that's why treasuries are completely trapped right now. It is almost impossible for some kind of serious crisis not to emerge from this situation. Now, if Bessent borrows the $10 trillion in long-term bonds, he can kick the problem down the road for a decade or more when it comes to repaying the debt. But the cost of borrowing will be so high that corporate credit grinds to a halt. The real economy chokes under the weight of the interest burden. But if he chooses to issue short-term T-bills instead, the refinancing cycle comes around faster and faster, and the deficit is going to grow even more rapidly. So we have reached a genuine point of no return on this. It's either we embrace an economic contraction, or what's more known as a recession now, or destroy the dollar to save the markets. That is the actual choice on the table right here. This is precisely why Dalio is just giving the US 2 to 3 years before a sovereign debt crisis arrives.
大家好，这里是华人看世界 CNView 频道。今天我们要聊的不只是美债市场的一次剧烈波动，而是一场正在逼近临界点的金融风暴。贝森特接连出手，干预日元，回购国债，试图稳住市场，可收益率短暂回落后又迅速反弹。投资者似乎已经看穿了所有救市动作背后的真实意图。美国政府究竟想靠什么化解不断膨胀的赤字？是继续举债放任通胀吞噬美元购买力，还是让美联储直接印钞托底？与此同时，外国投资者正在减持美债，资金可能转向黄金。而特朗普对抛售美债者发出的强硬威胁，也可能让全球买家彻底失去信心。更危险的是，未来几年将有巨额债务集中到期，美国究竟还能不能找到足够的新买家？这一切又会如何影响美元、黄金以及普通人的财富安全？接下来，我们就从美债危机、美元贬值，到地缘政治冲突，一层层拆解这场越来越难以收场的风暴。
Alright guys, so let's talk about the US bond market right now. The collapse is truly horrifying to watch. Every intervention Bessent tries simply does not work. The market can see through the smoke, they can see through all the mirrors completely. Now, the amount of cope coming out of the administration is just epic. Even the US Energy Secretary is trying to jawbone inflation down to everyone. Suddenly, the US has helped ship over 15 million barrels through the strait, and the 7-day average is now running at 8 million barrels daily. But even that's true, it still means over 10 million barrels per day are missing from global markets. The administration is doing everything possible to push energy prices lower. They're trying to do everything except end the war in Iran. Because if they cannot get inflation down, the bond market keeps crumbling. And that is the last thing Trump can afford right now. In just 4 weeks, Bessent launched enormous interventions to prevent the treasury market from imploding. Now, he rescued the yen to stop Japan from dumping US bonds. He must have already seen the data clearly. Japan dumped $26 billion worth of treasuries in June alone. But it's not just Japan and China selling. In total, the entire world reduced their US debt holdings by an astounding $72 billion in one single month. And it makes complete sense when you think about it. Nobody trusts that the US can ever get their spending under control ever again. Now, Trump keeps spending on the war, he keeps blowing money on projects that has nothing to address the debt crisis. He also confirmed what everyone feared the most: there's no grand plan to actually reduce the deficit or solve the debt problem at its root. The only lever left is to inflate the debt away deliberately. And Trump just made a very telling admission that this is exactly the direction they are heading in.
As you know, it's surpassed 40 trillion. Have you been discussing what to do about that?
Well, I have, and there's been a problem for 35 years. And what we have now that we've never had before, and the way you take care of debt is with growth. And we have tremendous growth. We've never had growth like we have right now. The growth will take care of that very easily.
Now, Trump wants us to believe that AI will suddenly drive explosive economic growth, that productivity will explode, people earn more and the tax base, tax revenue suddenly expands overnight. But that is almost certainly a fantasy, and the scale and the timeline being implied is not going to happen. The more likely scenario is much simpler and much more painful. Now, Trump wants to keep borrowing enormous sums of money to pump GDP growth artificially. He will allow inflation to run hotter and let the dollar devalue to manufacture the growth numbers he needs. But the market is not fooled. Everyone can see through this arrangement now. That is precisely why Besson's intervention have already collapsed. Now, before the buybacks, the 10-year yield was at 4.7%. And just hours after the dramatic announcement, we were right back at 4.7%. US bonds are still crashing because investors finally understand the real picture. Now, if the government is willing to tolerate 4 to 5% inflation, investors, they're going to demand 6 to 7% yields on the 10-year just to break even in real terms. They will demand even more for 30-year bonds because it makes no sense to lend money at a discount to a government that is eroding the purchasing power of your repayments, and they're telling you that the underlying asset, which is the dollar itself, is going to erode faster than ever before. And maybe that is why all the headlines are now turning against the US simultaneously. Now, the dollar has crashed by over 1% and it is now sitting at a 3-month low. August is shaping up to be a real bloodbath for the dollar. Now, this is Japan-style currency debasement playing out in real time, and it's regardless of what label Besson really puts on it. When you start yield curve control, which means pushing yields down, you send to the markets a very clear signal. The message is that the currency does not matter anymore. All the government cares about is to prevent treasuries from imploding completely. And if you think things cannot get any more extreme, they absolutely can. Now, Trump just threatened military intervention to defend the bond market. Now, I did not expect to be saying those words, but here we are right now.
You direct Secretary Besson to intervene in the bond market? Was
No,
that your idea?
not at all. No, he's a very capable man. He wanted to do it. He did that, yeah.
The yields have come back up since then. Have you talked to him about another type of intervention? Is that something he will
We
be
have
doing?
many types of intervention. That's one. The ultimate intervention is our military. And if we have to use that, we will, yeah.
So the question becomes, what exactly does this threat actually mean? Now, is Trump going to use force against bond sellers? Does he mean bombing the bond market? Does he mean mobilizing military pressure to stop countries from dumping US treasuries? Now, things are deeply bizarre because he has already made threats against US asset sellers. Now, back in Davos, Trump warned the EU of big retaliation if they moved to dump US stocks and bonds, and that warning was alarming enough on its own. Now, this threat appears to be escalating towards something even more destabilizing, something even more extreme. But it's not going to work. It's going to backfire tremendously. Now, countries might be too afraid to sell their existing bond holdings if Trump uses the military, but they will absolutely refuse to buy any additional US bonds under those conditions. The buying is going to freeze up entirely, and that is a far worse outcome than an orderly sell-off. Consider the scale of what is at stake here. Foreigners hold 40% of all outstanding US Treasury bonds in total, and that includes funds, central banks, private investors, and corporations spread across the globe. Now, if they cannot sell the holdings freely, what kind of reserve asset is a US Treasury bond? It becomes a financial prison. You cannot exit when you need to, and losing central banks as structural buyers would be very devastating and very hard to reverse. And these are buy and hold positions that provide stable baseline demand at every single auction. You cannot replace sovereign buyers with hedge funds, retail traders, or Besson's favorite, stablecoin users. You need governments to keep showing up reliably and keep buying your new issuance. There's no replacing them. And with Trump's latest threats, countries will be thinking very carefully before adding any new exposure to US debt. The damage to long-term structural demand could be permanent by now. The US is not going to find enough new buyers globally to replace the ones walking away, and there's definitely not enough domestic demand at current yield levels to fill that gap either, which means Either the Federal Reserve will have to print money to buy the debt back directly, or yields have to move dramatically higher to lure enough buyers back in. Now, either path leads to serious economic damage. There is no comfortable middle ground available anymore. And maybe that's why even mainstream media is now pushing the narrative of dumping dollars and buying gold instead. This is something we have been saying for years, something we have been saying since gold was $2,000 an ounce. Now, Ray Dalio is back and telling investors directly to reduce their bond holdings significantly. He is back from Ibiza with a big warning. He recommends putting as much as 15% of a portfolio into gold specifically. He's describing in plain terms how to protect yourself against dollar debasement. And that is what happens when investor confidence in a currency collapses steadily over time. And his warning is stark and is rather specific. The US government simply cannot stop spending money, and that inability is making the problem much worse with every passing quarter. Now, Dalio gave us 3 numbers that should make every investor sit up immediately. The deficit this year could balloon to a stunning $2 trillion shortfall. Interest costs alone will easily exceed $1 trillion for the year. And all of that money must be borrowed into existence, making future interest costs even larger in this doom loop. But here's the most alarming number of all. $10 trillion worth of debt needs to be refinanced in the coming years. The cheap debt borrowed at 2 to 3% yields will be maturing and rolling over, so Scott Bessent will need to replace it with a new debt at 4 to 5% yield at minimum. He cannot simply print $10 trillion to pay it back without destroying the currency entirely. It's going to cause hyperinflation. And that's why treasuries are completely trapped right now. It is almost impossible for some kind of serious crisis not to emerge from this situation. Now, if Bessent borrows the $10 trillion in long-term bonds, he can kick the problem down the road for a decade or more when it comes to repaying the debt. But the cost of borrowing will be so high that corporate credit grinds to a halt. The real economy chokes under the weight of the interest burden. But if he chooses to issue short-term T-bills instead, the refinancing cycle comes around faster and faster, and the deficit is going to grow even more rapidly. So we have reached a genuine point of no return on this. It's either we embrace an economic contraction, or what's more known as a recession now, or destroy the dollar to save the markets. That is the actual choice on the table right here. This is precisely why Dalio is just giving the US 2 to 3 years before a sovereign debt crisis arrives. That is the window before either a default or money printing that constitutes a technical default becomes unavoidable. Now remember, this entire madness is not happening in isolation. On the geopolitical front, things are escalating in a very equally concerning direction. Now, Bessent has essentially gone full Sith Lord Darth Vader in his latest pronouncements. He is now telling US allies directly to follow orders and help isolate Iran completely. Now, his message to every allied country is very simple, it's very brutal.
这期内容真正值得关注的，并不只是美债收益率短期上升了多少，也不只是美元汇率下跌了多少，而是市场正在重新评估一个更根本的问题：美国政府究竟还有没有能力，也有没有意愿控制不断扩大的财政赤字和债务规模？过去很长时间里，美债被视为全球金融体系中最重要的避风港，各国央行、主权基金、商业银行和大型机构都会把贸易顺差和外汇储备配置到美国国债上。因为在传统逻辑中，美国拥有强大的经济体量、稳定的制度体系和全球最主要的储备货币，持有美债就等于拥有一种安全。流动性高，随时可以变现的资产，但现在真正发生变化的，恰恰是这种信任正在被一点点消耗。投资者看到的不再只是美国的经济增长和科技优势，也看到了持续扩张的财政支出、越来越沉重的利息负担，以及不断到期必须重新融资的巨额债务。当一个政府需要借更多的钱来支付过去借款产生的利息时，债务就不再只是一个统计数字，而会变成一台不断自我加速的机器。问题在于，美国似乎没有真正意义上的解决方案。削减支出会触动国内各个利益集团，提高税收会影响企业和选民。 通过经济衰退压低需求，又会带来失业、破产和政治压力，于是最容易被接受的道路就变成继续借债，继续刺激经济，同时容忍更高的通胀，让货币购买力在不知不觉中下降。这也是市场最担心的地方。政府可以通过行政命令、政策声明，甚至短期回购行动，暂时改变价格，却很难改变投资者对未来的判断。如果市场相信通胀会长期高于过去，投资者就不会愿意用较低的收益率去锁定10年甚至30年的资金，因为他们担心今天借出去的钱，未来收回来时，实际购买力已经缩水。所以债券市场的压力本质上不是一次普通的波动，而是对财政信用、货币价值和政策可信度的一次集中审判。收益率越高，政府融资成本就越重，融资成本越重，赤字就越容易扩大，赤字越大，市场就越担心政府会通过通胀稀释债务。这个循环一旦形成，任何单一政策都很难轻易将它打断。更值得警惕的是，国际关系正在加速金融信任的变化。如果一个国家公开要求其他国家不能自由出售自己的资产，甚至用制裁、报复或军事压力来威胁潜在卖家，那么这些国家即使暂时不抛售手中的美债，也很可能不会再继续增持。储备资产最重要的价值之一，就是能够在需要的时候自由进出。一旦这种自由受到威胁，资产本身的安全属性就会被重新定义。这也解释了为什么所谓的强硬姿态可能最终产生相反效果。恐惧也许能够阻止一部分资金立即离场，却无法创造真正的长期买盘。一个国家可以被迫暂时保持沉默，却很难被迫持续把未来的储备投入到一个他不再信任的市场。对于主权投资者来说，分散风险、增加黄金和其他资产配置都是合乎逻辑的选择。从这个角度来看，黄金价格走强并不只是投资者在追逐一种商品，更像是对货币信用变化的投票。当越来越多国家拥有贸易顺差，却不再把这些美元大规模买回美国国债，而是转向黄金、能源、实物资产和其他货币，全球金融体系的资金循环就会发生改变。美国过去能够以较低成本吸收储蓄，依赖的正是这种循环。一旦循环减弱，美国就必须用更高的收益率来吸引买家，或者让中央银行承担更多购买债务的责任。前一种选择会压缩企业融资、房地产投资和居民消费，经济可能陷入衰退；后一种选择则会增加货币供应，进一步损害美元购买力。也就是说，美国面对的并不是一条轻松的道路，而是在经济收缩和货币贬值之间进行艰难选择。无论最终选择哪一边，普通民众都可能通过更高的生活成本、更贵的贷款和更少的就业机会，承担这场债务危机的代价。而地缘政治的升级又让这个金融问题变得更加复杂，能源运输受阻，制裁范围扩大，盟友之间的压力增加，都会推高交易成本，扰乱供应链，并把通胀压力重新传导到全球市场。美国希望通过施压来维护自身优势，但其他国家也会因此加快寻找替代渠道，减少对单一金融体系和单一货币的依赖。这场变化不会在1天之内完成，也未必会以一场立刻发生的崩盘作为结局。更可能出现的是美元购买力持续下降，国债收益率长期处在高位，政府不断推出新的干预措施，市场则一次又一次用更高的风险溢价回应。真正危险的往往不是某一个交易日的暴跌，而是投资者逐渐形成共识，过去那种稳定、低成本、自动吸收全球资金的时代已经结束了。对普通人来说，这期内容最重要的启示不是简单的压住某一种资产，也不是被某个惊人的数字牵着情绪走，而是要理解风险正在如何传导。债券价格、美元汇率、能源价格、黄金走势和地缘政治并不是彼此孤立的新闻，它们共同反映着全球信任、资本流向和货币购买力的变化。在不确定性增加的时代，保持现金流、控制杠杆、分散资产、审慎判断信息来源，比追逐短期热点更加重要。美国能否重新建立财政纪律？全球各国是否会继续增持美债？黄金能否取代一部分传统储备功能？接下来几年的答案将影响的不只是华尔街，也会影响每一个家庭的存款、房贷、工作和生活成本。市场最终不会长期相信口号，它只会相信真实的收支、持续的政策和能够兑现的承诺。那么你怎么看？世界会因为压力而继续留在美债体系之中，还是会加快分散储备，减少美元资产？美国还有没有机会通过控制支出和恢复信用，避免债务危机进一步扩大？ 欢迎把你的判断和理由写在评论区，也欢迎点赞订阅，观看更多精彩视频，让我们一起看清这个疯狂时代背后的真实变化。